Did you know that in medieval times, people once locked a bishop in a dungeon so dark and damp that mushrooms began to grow from the walls around him? That's not the beginning of a horror story. It's a small glimpse into the bizarre and often forgotten history of medieval dungeons. Today we're stepping into those cold stone chambers. We'll explore what they looked like, how they were used, and what daily survival was really like for the unfortunate souls trapped within. Imagine the creak of iron hinges, the heavy air of mold and sweat, and the strange medieval laws that could land you in one of these underground nightmares. Picture yourself in the Middle Ages. You've just been accused of breaking a strange law. Perhaps you wore the wrong color of clothing, spoke against your lord, or even refused to pay a peculiar tax. The punishment? Not execution, not a public flogging. Instead, you're dragged through winding castle halls until a guard swing opens a door leading down into darkness. The medieval dungeon wasn't designed to be a place of rehabilitation, or even necessarily of punishment. It was primarily a holding space, a liminal zone between accusation and judgment. Unlike today's prisons, medieval people rarely expected a long-term stay. You might be kept for a few days, weeks, or if forgotten, years. The descent itself would have been terrifying. Narrow spiral staircases carved into stone, torches flickering against the damp walls, and the constant clang of armor echoing in your ears. The deeper you went, the colder the air became, until sunlight and warmth felt like distant memories. But here's the twist. Not all dungeons were created equal. Some were simple cellars repurposed to keep local troublemakers. Others, beneath mighty castles, were designed as psychological weapons. These were built to terrify. Rooms so small you couldn't stand upright, or pits you couldn't climb out of. And yet entering wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Because once the heavy iron door shut, life in the dungeon unfolded in bizarre and unexpected ways. Imagine this. You're sitting on a stone floor, your back pressed against damp walls. The first thing you notice isn't the sight of chains or the weight of darkness. It's the smell. Medieval dungeons reeked of stagnant water, human waste, rotting straw, and mold. Without proper ventilation, air turned heavy, carrying with it the sour stench of unwashed bodies. Rats thrived here, feeding on scraps and gnawing at prisoners' belongings, or sometimes at the prisoners themselves. And then there was the sound. From above, muffled footsteps of guards echoed through stone ceilings. Dripping water played a constant rhythm, sometimes so loud it felt maddening. Chains clanked in the dark, reminding you that others were nearby, though you might never see their faces. In some dungeons, prisoners were deliberately kept in isolation. In others, bodies were crammed together, creating a chorus of coughs, whispers, and desperate prayers. Strangely, the medieval dungeon wasn't always silent despair. Records tell of prisoners singing to pass time, carving graffiti into stone, and even holding secret conversations through walls by tapping on them. But with every moment, your senses were under assault. Smell, sound, and darkness. And yet the dungeon had more to offer than just discomfort. It was also a stage for medieval superstition and lore, where bizarre beliefs shaped daily survival. One of the most fascinating things about medieval times is how easy it was to end up in a dungeon for reasons that seem bizarre to us today. Did you know there were strange laws against wearing certain colors of clothing? In some kingdoms, only nobles could wear purple or fine furs. Fair peasant caught breaking these rules might find themselves facing time in a dungeon or take debt. In ancient times, failing to pay your taxes or owing money to the wrong lord could lead not only to confiscation of property, but also to imprisonment. The dungeon became a financial weapon, a way to pressure families into paying ransoms or fines. Even animals weren't safe. Believe it or not, medieval records describe animals like pigs or even donkeys being tried in court and sentenced to confinement. While most animals were executed, there are rare cases suggesting they were temporarily locked away as offenders of the law. For nobles and knights, the laws were different. Capture on the battlefield often meant a dungeon stay, not as punishment, but as part of ransom negotiations. A knight might be treated relatively well, given straw bedding or even wine, while commoners suffered in the same dark corridor. These strange laws remind us that the dungeon wasn't just a place of cruelty. It was a tool of control, a symbol of power. But once inside, no matter the reason, Your survival hinged on how you endured daily life in the Middle Ages. So, what was daily life really like for those locked away? Let's walk through an average day, if we can even call it that. Morning didn't begin with sunlight. Most cells were deep underground without windows. You woke instead to the shuffle of guards or the drip of water on stone. Food was meager, often just stale bread and a thin gruel of barley or peas. Water might be given, but it was rarely clean. Sometimes ale or weak beer replaced it, since contaminated water was a known risk. Your bed? Straw, if you were lucky. Often it was the bare floor crawling with insects. Prisoners wrapped themselves in scraps of cloth or nothing at all to shield against the chill. Hygiene barely existed. Buckets might serve as chamber pots, emptied infrequently. Diseases spread easily and lice were constant companions. Many prisoners emerged from dungeons nearly unrecognizable, covered in sores and weakened by months without sunlight. Yet, bizarrely, not all stories are entirely bleak. Some wealthy prisoners bribed guards for comforts, a candle, fresh straw, or even small luxuries like playing cards or writing materials. Chronicles tell of noble captives composing poetry in their cells, turning confinement into unexpected creativity. Still, for most, survival was about endurance. Enduring the cold, enduring the hunger, enduring the uncertainty of how long you'd be there. Because the greatest torment of all wasn't always physical, it was psychological. You never truly knew if you'd be released tomorrow, next year, or never. And that uncertainty leads us to one of the strangest truths about dungeons. They were as much about power and fear as they were about justice. In the Middle Ages, life revolved around authority, kings, lords, bishops, and the church. The dungeon was never just a building, it was a statement. To lock someone underground was to show the community that power was absolute. The threat of the dungeon often worked better than the dungeon itself. Just the rumor of being chained beneath the castle was enough to keep many people obedient. But what's fascinating is how unevenly this tool was applied. Nobles could negotiate, bribe, or ransom their way out. Commoners, however, had no such leverage. For them, a dungeon stay could mean permanent disappearance, their names erased from records. And yet, stories survived. Some prisoners famously endured and even escaped. Chronicles speak of daring rope descents, secret tunnels, or bribed jailers. These tales spread across villages, feeding both fear and hope. In the end, the dungeon wasn't only a place of physical captivity, it was a theater of medieval psychology, designed to instill obedience, fear, and awe in a world ruled by strange laws and unforgiving hierarchies. But there's one more layer to this story, a layer that reveals just how bizarre medieval thinking could become when superstition and imprisonment collided. While many dungeons were simple holding cells, some were designed with chilling creativity. These weren't just prisons, they were punishments in themselves. Take the oubliette, a word that literally means to forget. This was a tiny, vertical pit into which prisoners were dropped. There was no door, no stairs, just a hole in the ceiling. Food, if given, was lowered by rope. The idea wasn't necessarily to kill, but to erase. The prisoner would be forgotten, out of sight, out of mind, lost to the world. Some dungeons were shaped to distort the body. Narrow cells forced prisoners to crouch or stand indefinitely, their muscles aching. Others were pitch black, where light was denied completely, plunging the mind into disorientation. In certain castles, waterlogged cells filled slowly with rising tides. Prisoners might survive for hours or days, clinging to stone until exhaustion took them. Was this common? Not at all. But the fact that such punishments existed tells us something important. Medieval rulers used imprisonment not just as justice, but as performance, designed to terrify anyone who heard the stories. And yet, even in these bizarre punishments, there were surprising contradictions. In some cases, dungeons held not criminals but political rivals, nobles kept alive for ransom or leverage. They might receive visitors, meals, even books, luxuries unheard of for commoners. So life in a medieval dungeon wasn't one uniform experience. It ranged from horrific to strangely privileged, depending on who you were. But one thing united all prisoners: the question of time. How long would this last? Would anyone remember them? Or would they fade into silence beneath the stones? That brings us to the forgotten prisoners, souls who entered a dungeon and never truly came back. One of the strangest and saddest aspects of medieval dungeons is how many stories were simply erased. Records speak of prisoners kept so long that their families assumed them dead, only to emerge years later, frail and unrecognizable. Others never left at all, their names vanishing from memory. When castles fell or cities changed rulers, dungeons were sometimes opened to reveal skeletons still chained to walls, silent witnesses to forgotten history. And then there are the legends. Some say entire groups of prisoners were walled up alive, a brutal practice meant to rid a lord of troublesome captives, without the public scandal of executions. While historians debate how often this really happened, the persistence of these tales shows how dungeons haunted the medieval imagination. There are also stories of unlikely survival. In 1370, chronicles describe a knight held for years in a French dungeon who spent his time carving elaborate chessboards into stone walls. He created games to keep his mind alive. Other accounts tell of monks secretly smuggling bread and wine to prisoners, risking their own lives in acts of quiet mercy. These stories remind us the dungeon was not just stone and iron. It was human endurance, human suffering, and occasionally human kindness in the darkest of places. But as Europe marched toward the Renaissance, the dungeon itself began to change. Its purpose shifted, and with it, the way we remember life in the Middle Ages. By the late Middle Ages, dungeons were losing their central role. Cities grew larger, laws became more formalized, and justice systems started to shift. In earlier centuries, punishment had been immediate and public, stocks, executions, or mutilations in front of a crowd. The dungeon was temporary, a holding space. But by the 14th and 15th centuries, we see the beginnings of longer-term imprisonment, the ancestor of modern prisons. Dungeons gave way to more structured jailhouses, though the conditions often remained just as miserable. At the same time, castles began to decline as the seat of absolute power. With gunpowder and cannons reshaping warfare, the mighty stone fortresses of medieval times became less central, and their dungeons faded into obscurity. Yet the memory of these places lingered. Writers and travelers spoke of their eerie silence, their grotesque punishments, their forgotten prisoners. The image of the dungeon lived on, becoming almost mythic, a symbol of medieval darkness, cruelty, and bizarre laws. And that's why today, when we picture life in the Middle Ages, the dungeon still fascinates us, because it represents the edge of human endurance, the strangeness of ancient times, and the uneasy balance between justice, superstition, and power. So, what was life really like in a medieval dungeon? It was damp stone under your hands, stale bread in your mouth, the sound of chains rattling in the dark. It was superstitions scribbled into walls, prayers whispered to saints, and fears that demons prowled nearby. It was bizarre laws and forgotten history, where a noble might negotiate wine and parchment while a peasant wasted away unseen. Above all, it was uncertainty. Days bled into nights without sunlight, time stretched into endless waiting, and the only certainty was the weight of stone pressing down from every direction. And yet the dungeon wasn't just cruelty. It was also creativity. Graffiti carved into walls, poems written by candlelight, secret songs tapped through stone. It was a place where the human spirit, though crushed, found small sparks of endurance. Next time you walk past the ruins of a castle, imagine what lies beneath your feet. Beneath the banquet halls, the courtyards, and the chapels, the dungeon waits. Its stones still hold echoes of strange laws, bizarre punishments, and the forgotten lives of those who endured life in the Middle Ages. So the question remains, if you found yourself locked in one of those dark chambers, would you have survived even a single night? Thank you for stepping with me into the shadows of medieval history. If you enjoyed exploring this forgotten world of dungeons, you'll love our next journey into the bizarre punishments of medieval times. From dancing plagues to strange laws that still shock us today. Don't forget to subscribe if you're fascinated by the hidden, the strange, and the unbelievable corners of history. And as always, I'll see you in the next story, where the past opens its doors once more.